Hello? Do you hear me well? Yeah. So, shall we start? It's a pleasure to meet you, to see you all. On behalf of Ukrainian think tank Liaison Office in Brussels and our partners from Center for Economic Strategies and of course the Bruegel, our today's host. It's my pleasure. My name is Olena Karbu and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here at our today's event on Ukraine economy in this turbulent times, political times. And yes, indeed, 2019, a little introduction, if for those who, of course, fully aware of where we are now, but just a little highlights of where we are right now. Yes, indeed, for Ukraine's economy, we prediction is a little slowdown in economy, 2.7% of GDP growth, compared to 3.5% of GDP growth in 2018. Then in regard of the political environment, as we have just all following, probably, right, all of us, the presidential elections in Ukraine followed now by early parliamentary elections very soon, although the legal basis is still questionable. And then the local elections of 2020 will also follow. And of course, simultaneously, European Union is also, we have just had the elections to the European Parliament just this weekend, and that will be following by the composition of the new Commission and all the governing bodies of the European Union. And so here we are, in terms of Ukraine, we in 2019 facing the payments of significant public debts. Cooperation with the International Monetary Fund is always very important. So, and this is the environment, the background, which makes these events and all our work is quite important. Because for us, it's also important to understand where we're moving, what to expect, what are the tasks for different parts of society, for the government, for us, what we lay down ahead of us. And to answer these questions and other questions, we grouped together today an excellent group of experts, officials, former officials, but those who are involved in EU-Ukraine relations, in development of the Ukraine's economy, who probably know more and can share with us what to expect. So, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Let me please take my notes. And today we have with us Elena Flores, who is International Economic and Financial Relations Global Governance Director in Economic and Financial Affairs DG of the European Commission. Filip Wyszliński, Executive Director of today's initiator of the events, Center for Economic Strategy. Together, welcome you here. Marek Dąbrowski, well-known expert on Ukraine and a non-residential fellow at Bruegel. And of course we have Ivan Miklos, who among his many positions, but now is chairman of the Strategic Advisory Group for Supporting Ukrainian Reform, spending, as I understand, 50% of working time in Ukraine. So, and here we are today. And before we start the chair, I would encourage you all to share your opinions on today's events. And you have the information all to join the conversation and how to get access to Wi-Fi. And hopefully after interventions of the speakers, we will have enough time for all of you to get your input, to give your inputs, your opinions, to share your comments and the questions. So shall we start? We will start with the clip, right? No, you have your mic,
yeah.
As I understand. As
yeah,
but
I need a clicker.
Ah, yes, clicker is just
clicker is here, yeah.
And we will start with the general overview of the Ukrainian economy. You want this mic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I forgot that I do have mic here. So my presentation will just try to explain what is the situation in Ukraine now, and like what are key challenges and what are key policies needed for Ukrainian economy to become stronger. Yeah. I decided to present like this general overview in like business format, like the format of SWOT analysis, which is not like very usual way for economic analysis, but still the situation is in my opinion good for this way. So like what we have among strengths of the Ukrainian economy now and for the coming year and a half, like we generally speak about this period as a sort of perspective when we want major risks to be prevented. So we have a rather small budget deficit in the last 5 years, and we have currently rather big leftovers in the budget that were Ministry of Finance was rather good in going to the market and like getting as much as possible before this period of political turbulence. We have rather manageable current account deficit that is smaller than 4% of GDP. Like among weaknesses, unfortunately, the list of weaknesses is longer, and it is generally longer term, I could say. So we have cluster economic growth of 2-3%, which is lower than emerging market peers, and that is not enough for Ukrainian economy to go fast to the same level when it was in 2007, for example, or 2008. We have the lowest foreign direct investment per capita in the region of Central and Eastern Europe, and decreasing capital stock in Ukraine as investment share in GDP is too low. We have a shrinking labor force because of demographic reasons and significant labor migration from Ukraine. We estimate that currently approximately 2.5 million of Ukrainians work abroad at any given day, on any given day. In terms of opportunities, like fortunately in this period of political turbulence, we have rather favorable terms of trade. Currently, prices for grain and steel are good for Ukraine. We expect the sovereign ratings of Ukraine will improve in 2 years, as performance for 5-year valuation period will be much better and will not include 2014 and 2015 when we had dire financial crisis. However, threats are also, the list of threats is longer as well. Like we have public sector external debt repayment of $20 billion in the current year and next 2 years. Like for you to compare, it is the same size as the size of gross international reserves of the National Bank of Ukraine. This year, the government should pay $3 billion, like only the government, not other state institutions, in upcoming months. And next year, the government should pay $5.4 billion US. The big risk factor is potential decrease or even stop of gas transit from Russia starting from January 1st, 2020. That should amount to losses of from 0.4 to 4% of GDP next year. And certainly, like we have political and policy unpredictability, like we have 8 days after the inauguration of the new president last Monday, but still, like we could not say much more about his policies. So let's look on some charts. You could see that growth rates in Ukraine were not very fast. Like fortunately, they were rather stable for the last 3 years. Like peaks that you could see are mostly results of good harvests, and agriculture is the fastest growing sector in Ukraine currently. And however, like with like this rather lackluster growth, we have fiscal responsibility. Like you could compare the period before end of 2013 and last 4 years, and you could see that like we maintain primary budget proficit and like positive balance, and like for example, for the last months we have data on the trailing government general government balance for 12 months. It was just 2.2% of GDP, which is rather healthy for Ukraine. But we are near the peak of public external debt repayments, and this is really like very important while complicated chart. Like you could see those like $20 billion dollars on this chart, like with 6 to 7 billions that should be repaid by Ukrainian Ministry of Finance and the National Bank within these 3 years, and slightly smaller figures that should be repaid by the Ministry of Finance, so they should be collected as taxes and then converted into foreign exchange. And you could see that like when somebody speaks about possibility of sovereign default, you could see that there is a significant share of official financing here. IMF money, EU money, World Bank money, bonds that are guaranteed by the US state guarantees. So it is not as easy as it was. Like, it was not very easy in 2015, but like it is not as easy as the restructuring of private debt. So what the new government should do in economic policy? So the first is maintaining macroeconomic stability. We see that like periods of economic growth in Ukraine were undermined by financial crisis all the time, and they were caused by macroeconomic imbalances like twin deficits, for example, when we had simultaneously large budget deficit and current account deficit. And unfortunately, despite hyperinflation episodes, Ukrainians are still open to populist ideas, and expectations of the government are too high, and public sector is still too large, especially to the quality compared to the quality of governance that we have in Ukraine. So Ukraine must maintain the central bank independence, must maintain prudent fiscal policy, and build trust with its creditors, and not to do what like one of Ukrainian oligarchs close to the current president, Igor Kolomoisky, recently proposed in the interview to Financial Times. And you could see here like why it is so important to have sustainable economic growth. Because there is an analysis done by the IMF, and like I took it from Dragon Capital report, that shows that the biggest problem for Ukraine is that we had too many years of real GDP decline. In the last 22 years, we have 8 years when Ukrainian real GDP declined, compared to, for example, 0 years for Poland, our closest neighbor, and now the biggest consumer of Ukrainian labor force. So then the second area where the government should focus on in economic policy is increasing productivity. So like two main policy reforms that we need to do is opening farmland market, and like we had like 2 months ago we had a very good study published by the World Bank and authored by the World Bank economists, and they did a very detailed analysis of potential economic growth of Ukraine, and they came with the idea that the only resource that Ukraine has to push economic growth significantly is our land, our natural resources, because like all other resources are in rather dire situation currently. So passing the law on the circulation of agricultural land, and thus cancelling moratorium on farmland land sales is a key reform. The second key reform is large-scale privatization, and it is not just about like those companies that are in the process of privatization. Now, the most important is to significantly shorten the list of enterprises prohibited from privatization. We believe that all state-owned banks should be privatized. We believe that some so-called jewels of the Ukrainian economy, like so-called strategic enterprises, should be researched in terms of like their future. Because, like, for example, if we speak about Energoatom that operates nuclear power stations, it should be open for investment, for example, of EU nuclear operators. The same goes to Ukrainian railways, the same goes to Ukrainian gas transit system. Like, we should attract more investment into it, and state generally owns too much in Ukraine. And the third is like free trade and capital, which is very important also for the integration with the European Union. So we need to simplify and streamline customs procedures, focus on infrastructure bottlenecks that are inevitable as Ukrainian trades refocused from Russia to the European Union. We need to liberalize capital controls and foreign exchange regulations. So we need to make Ukrainian companies more competitive in the global value chains and more open to investment. What the government should do in other areas? The number one is establish the rule of law. So investment risks are still too high, and the lack of trust to judiciary and widespread corruption are top obstacles for foreign investment in Ukraine. Like you could see here, the results of the surveys that we conducted for 4 years together with the European Business Association and Dragon Capital, and you could see that corruption and lack of trust in judiciary are top 2 for all 4 years. And for example, military conflict with Russia, even in 2016, was just on the 3rd place. Another 2 areas that are important is restoring labor force and increasing human capital. We generally need to increase labor participation rates by introducing more available daycare facilities for working mothers. We need to rethink higher education. Ukraine spends too much on higher education. 80% of pupils that are graduating from schools go to universities, and 50% of them or even more are financed by the state, while we see decline in labor force in Ukraine, and they are generally just losing years in low quality universities of Ukraine. Even if we have the government that wants to do something that is on the verge of populism, we should stimulate birth rates that are still very, very, very low in Ukraine. We need to rethink migration policies, we need to care about our migrants abroad, but also we need to open labor market carefully. For example, we had a good experience of unilaterally opening Ukraine for short-term trips to the EU nationals before European Union opened its borders to Ukrainians. We could consider doing the same for EU nationals and unilaterally open labor markets. It will be a good signal to the European companies to invest in Ukraine. And also we need to invest more into healthcare. We have lower share of public spend as share of GDP and the share of budget expenditures and CE peers. So we need healthy workforce. And we need to fight for the EU membership perspective. We see from our analysis that Georgia is the only CE country that was able to achieve progress without the EU membership perspective. We still need to understand to which extent it is sustainable, and the only cases of sustainable economic growth were seen in those countries that became EU members during the last 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Gleb. Thank you very much for this quite impressive list of tasks standing on behalf of, in front of Ukraine, not only in economic but non-economic areas, especially for me, establishment, rule of law. Which any timeline you have for this?
In fact, it is It is rather complicated. However, like we have one tool that could be used rather fast. This tool is High Anti-Corruption Court that recently was established. Like by establishing, we mean there is enough judges to start operations of this court. Technically, it should start working in early September, I believe, and like in my opinion, this court could like make real change by focusing on judges, because like I know that, for example, here in Brussels and in the European Commission, like there are mixed opinions on, and also like in Ukraine the same, on judiciary reforms that we saw in Ukraine in the last 3 years. To which extent was it successful? We believe that like the self-cleaning of judges by judges was not effective enough, and we need to either restart this process, or we need to change, like to make those judges that are corrupt to stop those practices just by fearing that they will be punished by the independent vertical starting from National Anti-Corruption Bureau to High Anti-Corruption Court.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hlip, very much. So we turn now on the EU side. Yeah, Ms. Flores, can you share your vision on Ukraine's economy? What are the risks, what are the challenges, and what are the tasks, what you see in front of EU, in front of Ukraine, but also EU-Ukraine? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion, where I think we have also much to learn from colleagues that are more on the ground every day than at least myself. I think that you really set out here the whole program. So I guess it will not be markedly different, but I will try to focus on a number of things from our perspective. Maybe first to say a couple of words on what has been achieved from our point of view, which, in such a situation like Ukraine, we are always tempted to say, okay, all these things are yet to be done. But I think we have to take a bit of a setback and see what has happened and where we are in that process. And you can have different views, whether you see, the glass half full or half empty. That's a matter of judgment, but in any case, it's not empty. That's what I wanted to say also first. So in terms of macro, I think that it has been a lot of progress, and since the moment of the peak of the conflict, growth has come back, as you showed in the graphs. And yes, it's not a high miraculous level, but still around 2-3% positive since 2016. It's a very good situation. If you look at all the macro variables, you showed fiscal balance, so public finances have been consolidating and has been managed in a good way. If you look at inflation, yes, it has decreased substantially. Look at the exchange rate, it remained fairly stable during that period. Foreign exchange reserves have been growing. So just to give a bit of the macro framework, which is pretty good compared to other countries that can be compared, let's say, with Ukraine. Now, in terms of reforms, we also think that lots of things have been done, in particular in the context of triggered by the association agreement with the EU, which also contains the deep and comprehensive free trade area. And this is into force in 2017, and we think that has been a sort of the framework to direct the reform process in Ukraine. Third point I wanted to make is that in terms of EU support, beyond the policy dialogue and the technical assistance, there is also a big bulk of financial support from the EU through different instruments, but I just kind of to pinpoint the three types of instruments. One is the macro-financial assistance, which is what we do together with the IMF in terms of stabilization program. In comparison to what is the normal practice or has been the normal practice in the EU until Ukraine came, well, for Ukraine, all in all, we have been mobilizing 3.3 billion, which is very big compared to what the EU was used to do in that front. And the important part of this is that there is a way to really, together with the authorities, with the Ukrainian authorities, to select and prioritize certain reforms that are critical for stabilizing the economy and getting an environment that is conducive to growth. So that's one. The second block is the grant assistance, which takes different forms, technical assistance, financing, in particular financing very well-identified reforms like judicial, public finance management, etc. This is about 1 billion since 2014. And then the third part is more investment related, which is the mobilization of public and private capital in order to finance, for instance, infrastructure investments or SMEs development. So that's, I think, the three types of support that are there also to accompany reforms. So all in all, since 14 to 4.5 billion has been the mobilized capital for supporting reform in Ukraine and economic growth. Now, if we come to the challenges, what I would highlight is, first of all, maybe on the macro, you also said it, is absolutely essential to keep the macroeconomic stability because that's the basics. If that goes wrong, everything will go wrong. I put it in very simple terms. So it's not something that you achieve and then is a given. It is not a given. I think that you need to strive permanently to keep it in a good shape. So that's the first point. The second point, and I will come back to this one later, the second point is about the challenge of debt repayment. You also showed the graph here, so I don't need to go into the details. This year and next will be quite tricky in terms of debt repayment. So that's a challenge, which means that you also see that link with the first one, because there will be a need to go to the markets. So we will not be able, the Ukrainian authorities will not be able to do it with only public financial support. There will be a need to go to the markets, and it's very important that the markets keep the positive view on Ukraine, also relatively to other emerging economies, because I think that we are in a context which we are set for some turbulences in the financial markets, maybe not on a permanent basis, but by moments, and emerging markets are not all in good shape. So it's important that Ukraine doesn't get bulked into, with the whole package, but it keeps the good positive view from the markets for facing that challenge. Now, in terms of reforms, the first package that I wanted to point to is what I could put under the label anti-corruption, knowing that anti-corruption to us has two aspects. One is more the institutional, and the other one is all the rest that has also an impact on the anti-corruption. So if you remove the possibilities for corruption, and this, I come back to the second one, but on the first one, the anti-corruption, what I would say to keep it short is that a lot of institutional legal changes have been done. So it's true that you have been pushing a lot for that, and not only us, but I think we have been very, very, very strong on that front. We are now in a moment that we need to see the track record of implementation. So we need to see that indeed those institutions that are there work and they deliver. So that's one of, that's part also of our macro-financial assistance conditions that are still to be fulfilled, is this proving track record implementation, and this goes for the High Anti-Corruption Court, but also for the other agencies. One of the issues we are now striving with our colleagues in Ukraine is this asset verification declaration system that is there basically, but there is still some way to go to show that it works, and it works effectively. So that's one example. So lots of progress on the institutional. Now we need to see the implementation. We have also seen some setbacks, like removing the illicit enrichment from the criminal code, some of the decisions related to the private bank nationalization. So this is a bit of a matter for concern. So we have, again, to see that the system can cope with this sort of setbacks and correct them. We have seen the new president taking strong statements on that front. So we have to see that translated into facts. And again, as I said, we have quite a number of these conditions in our macro-financial assistance that we hope will be complied with soon, despite the elections and all the rest. But we think that this should be continued and not wait for any new government to restart again. Now, to the transformation of the economy, I see a number of elements. One also has been mentioned, is about the state-owned enterprises. Here, I think there are two aspects. One is the governance of the SOEs, and the other is the privatization. The two are, to me, equally important. So progress has been made on the governance. Some enterprises have had these supervisory independent board members established, but is not yet finished. So the process should really go until the end and covering the whole range of enterprises. And together with that, the privatization in, I would say, in an orderly and efficient way to avoid mistakes and surprises, because that's also some areas where other countries had good and bad experiences. So one has to do it in the right sequence, in the right way also. Then energy sector. This is very critical, and this is also linked to removing reasons for corruption. So we have also been pushing very much to adopting the new legislation, market legislation for electricity and gas, which is there, and now implementation. Our judgment is that implementation is low for the many reasons, so that has to be stepped up. In terms of investment, clearly Ukraine needs domestic and foreign investment, cannot just achieve the necessary growth with domestic financing. And for this, obviously, a lot of the reforms that are included in the association agreement have to be implemented to remove barriers and to do the legal approximation to the EU law to facilitate the Ukraine to benefit and to take all the possibilities that offer this approximation to the EU. The land reform, again, for us, it seems to be also a very important element, and we know what are the difficulties, but they have to be overcome, because this is really, as you mentioned, this is one of the, it's the critical sector to get growth from the current to a new stage, and there is a need for improving productivity and a different way of producing, basically, which is related to the functioning of the land market, basically. Another point I wanted to mention is the reform of the tax and custom services that we have also been pushing very much, the separation between tax and custom services. And there are a number of steps still to be taken there, and the aim is obviously to get these two systems functioning efficiently and independently, as it should be. A final comment on the financial sector. You mentioned non-performing loans. Indeed, this is a legacy issue that has to be addressed. And the other aspect that we think it's important is to develop the supervision system in an adequate way, both for banking in the central bank, for non-banking in the corresponding authority. This is, has been progressed quite a lot, but still there are some steps to be taken. And this is obviously very important for the investment point that I mentioned. And the last aspect that I think it has not been mentioned, we also think it's important that growth becomes more inclusive. And this is related to the reform of the education system that you mentioned, but also to the pensions and healthcare systems, which is also something that still remains to be done. So that's basically what I wanted to cover. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Florence. It's good to hear a lot of interflows between the assessments of the current situation and also the tasks. And I hope that this sandwich, as we call it, right, approach with the pressure from EU and experts and civil society pressure from inside of Ukraine will continue to make impacts on economic growth of Ukraine and reforms. So thank you both for this, setting up the stage. And Marek, we are turning to you with another set of tasks and for reforms priorities in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Olena. My presentation is mainly on agenda of reforms which should be undertaken regardless who will form the new government. The time is very pressing. Actually, the title of today's seminar is precise in the way that should be, instead of a year, should be years of political turbulence. According to my perception, the last serious reform were accepted by Verkhovna Rada in September, October 2017. And given the political timetable which Ukraine face, forthcoming parliamentary elections and forming government, etc., that probably this break in reforming will take at least 2 years. So it's high time to come back. Let me start from macroeconomic challenges. Many of this issue were already here articulated, so I will not repeat too much. Probably where my presentation slightly differs from Gleb presentation is that I am not so optimistic on the fiscal balances. Of course, one can say that the deficit of 2 or 3% of GDP for most of advanced economies like EU economies, so it's not a big issue. It can be financed, can be sustained for a longer period of time, but not in situation in Ukraine, where the source of potential finance are very, very limited. And let me give here the picture. This is from recent IMF country report. And it's seen that first the debt remained pretty high. It decreased since its peak level in 2016, but still is over 60% of GDP. And most of this debt is debt in foreign currency. And basically the entire situation hangs on exchange rate. Since 2015, we have more or less stable exchange rate, so the debt stabilized first and then declined, and also inflation went down, and several expenditures of budget stabilized. But if any shocks happen, domestic or external, this entire construction will collapse. Probably debt will shoot up above 100% of GDP with such structure. And also the chart which was presented by Gleb, it's also demonstrates another problem. There is a big accumulation of debt obligations in the coming 2-3 years. So basically, again, some people are optimistic. Ukraine came back to the market, and indeed, its government's able to borrow something on the market, but it is possible only because all market participants are aware that IMF plus EU plus World Bank, etc., remain the lenders of last resort. If for any reasons this cooperation collapses, Ukraine very quickly remains bankrupt. So I think that this is also a factor which I think has also impact on business climate, investment climate. Apart from all very well-known geopolitical risk, unsolved conflict in Donbass, etc., perception that country doesn't stay firmly on macroeconomic ground is another. And situation is macroeconomically very fragile. It's another factor which, other things being equal, decreases the appetite for investing in Ukraine, not only for investors, but also for domestic investors. Very well known that in Ukraine, like in other countries of former Soviet Union, the problem of let's say, moving capital between domestic market and offshores it's quite easy, despite all foreign exchange controls and capital market, capital account controls, and even current account controls for large investment group is quite easy to do, and it's important that this kind of uncertainty it's remaining. Second thing, which was not articulated so far, is the financial fragility. Despite enormous effort of National Bank of Ukraine and government, previous to governments, to clean up situation in banking sector, the situation still remains very fragile. I personally found in IMF report the data that non-performing loans exceed 50% of the total loan portfolio. This is enormous amount. And this means that on the top of more than 10 billions, or probably close to 20 billions of US dollars, which already were injected into Ukrainian banking sector in the last 5 years, probably another several billions will have to be injected to make this sector sustainable and avoid banking crisis. So, and this also stress on several vulnerabilities in corporate governance, both in banking sector but also in corporate sector. Okay, now what can be done to improve fiscal balances? And also Ukraine is typical case of twin deficit, largely because of limited capital account de facto and de jure openness, and limited interest to foreign investors. So, despite several changes in the pension system, not only 2017 reform, but also before, where some partial correction of the system aimed to curb various kind of entitlements and expenditures. The pension programs remain the largest expenditure item. The difference is that in the past it approached something like 15% GDP, then it was 11%, now stabilized around 10%. But the question stabilized for how long? We must take into consideration demographic trends, which cannot be changed for the next 30 years, if any time. And also we must take into account that replacement rate, this relation between average pension and wage, despite some improvement in 2017, is still relatively low. So if we want keep system going, avoid its total financial collapse, probably further reform, which would be limit the number of beneficiaries of the system are necessary. Whether they will be done by increasing retirement age or further increase of number of years which qualify to receiving pension benefit. This is technical matter, but this process must be continued. Now also was thought about energy sector reform. There is few issues here. In 2016, the Groisman government did a large step forward in bringing gas prices to cost recovery level, but then this achievement was compromised in many ways. So basically it's the problem of keeping gas pricing on a market level and then move towards market determination of gas prices, which this is obligation taken by government vis-à-vis IMF, which should happen, as far as I understand, in 2020, but I understand there is many question marks, political question marks, whether it will happen or not. Naftogaz restructuring, which was to start a few years ago, didn't start. Then the same concerns elimination for domestic gas production, which is very much dependent on licenses and many others, tax regime, production sharing agreement, and this kind of stuff. And then more general energy market regulation, which also rise, including or maybe especially electricity, which was also source of many controversies and also definitely as a large source of rents and corruption in Ukraine. Okay. Sorry, something doesn't work. Other structural reforms, they were already mentioned. I would probably add abandoning monopoly of Ukrainian railways for cargo transportation. Also, privatization is important not only for improving business climate and microeconomic efficiency, but eliminating corruption, probably is one of the largest remaining sources of corruption, and also for reducing public debt. Selling some large enterprise or banks then can reduce the public debt to GDP ratio, which is, it's probably this is the main remaining source which can help situation. Now, despite that I am economist by training, but dealing for so many years with Ukrainian reform, it's also suggests some lessons regarding political system, political reform. And I think that some of them need really some serious approach. First is constitution, which is simply dysfunctional. It's two-head executive with potential for conflict. And then is the difficulties with forming parliamentary majority and government, even if formed. Then there's question whether the government can effectively work and keep its majority in parliament. And then is also a lot of contradictory rules and interpretation, which we were witnesses last week, for example, when this parliament was dissolved, whether it was according to constitution or against constitution. Then another question is mixed electoral system, with especially single seat constituency, creating a lot of corruption. Then is unsolved problem of financing political parties and election campaigns. Then are majority rules in Verkhovna Rada. Because we have 27 vacancies in Rada, actually the majority for legislation, constitutional changes is larger de facto than it should be according to constitution. And also, by the way, moving to totally proportional election system could avoid these vacancies. Then decentralization is a very important issue, was only partly accomplished by some progress in voluntary consolidation of smallest territorial units, hromadas, and by fiscal decentralization, but both are not sustainable because they don't have constitutional basis, and constitution changes were blocked because of they were in one package with the special status of Donbass. And other institutional reforms also mention judicial system. I would add here police and various kind of law enforcement agencies. And I must say that it's not a unique problem for Ukraine. This is a common problem for all countries of former Soviet Union, perhaps even some countries Central Eastern Europe, that this is a large source of business harassing, of extracting rents, of corruption, of inefficiencies, and something was done, but it's a long way ahead to complete this kind of reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marek, first of all, for stressing out the painful or actual points in Ukraine economy, and especially stressing on importance of continuing cooperation with the International Monetary Fund, and a special thank for bridging with the political environment, and it brings us to our next speaker. Yes, indeed. So, political environment changed, difficult political environment, and tasks in the economy. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me start by saying that I agree with everything that was said, and this kind of relatively different view on more optimistic by Hlib and more pessimistic by Marek. I think I'm closer to Hlib's view in short-term perspective, but then closer to Marek's view in mid-term perspective. I will explain why. It is connected with the politics, of course. Which means I will not repeat what was said because, as I said, I agree. I will speak more about politics and political economy of reforms. As we all know, reforms everywhere, not only in Ukraine, are even more political challenge than technical. Speaking about what was necessary to do, everything is written in the program of the government, in program with the IMF, in association agreement, in strategy 2020, which means in all these official documents which have been passed in Ukraine 5 and 4 years ago. I will not speak about what was done. I will more try to answer why not more, because this I think important. Why it was not done more during these 5 years. And I think there are two kind of arguments why. First are objective. I mean objective, which means there have been two unrealistic expectations what is necessary to do, and then it was simply impossible to meet all these expectations. But then they have been also subjective, which means it was possible to do more, maybe not to meet all these expectations that now in 1-2 years everything will be done. But of course it was also a lack of will, courage and leadership to do these reforms. Both of these. And then the result is that we have now kind of narrative both outside Ukraine but also inside Ukraine that almost nothing was done, still it is huge corruption, people's dissatisfaction is really, really big. Then presidential elections results are good evidence of this. Why? Firstly, I think, as I said, reforms, the most important preconditions for successful reforms are leadership, ownership, and communication of reforms. Leadership means that we have to have leaders, political leaders, who have vision, will, and courage to do reforms. They are convinced about necessity to do reforms. They are fighting for reforms. They are communicating, and so on and so on. It is connected also with this ownership. Ownership means that politicians are doing reforms not because pressure from outside, from financial market, from the EU, from the IMF, but because they are convinced about necessity for improving people's life and competitiveness of economy and create preconditions for high and sustainable economic growth. And communication means that they have to communicate, they have to spend a lot of effort, almost all energy possible to fight against populists, to explain why reforms are necessary and so on and so on. In Ukraine, I'm not saying that there is no leadership, I'm not saying that there is no ownership, but it was insufficient to achieve, better results, let's say like that. Firstly, we have to understand, in my opinion, also observers outside, that this old system, this oligarchic, corrupted, non-functioning system was such deeply rooted that to change this is really, really struggle and difficult task. If you can imagine just what happened, successful countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia at that time when communism collapsed, it was the breakdown of the old system, and on this institutional vacuum, it was created new system of functioning market economy with problems, but it was. In Ukraine, it didn't happen, and it was created this oligarchic corrupted system where oligarchs really captured the state and they have unlimited political economic power, and corruption is not only on the highest oligarch level, but in all levels of the society. Then what happened in 2014, after Revolution of Dignity, the old system, this oligarchic system, was not disappeared, not collapsed. When new elites came to power, we can even say that there were no new elites. They were part of old elites, more pro-reform and more pro-EU integration, part of old elites. But all power, especially economic power, power in media, power in judiciary, in law enforcement institutions, have been held by old oligarchs, businessmen, old politicians, old elites. Even significant part of MPs in newly elected Rada in 2014 have been influenced not by real program of real parties which had ideological kind of background and so on and so on. Which means in this situation, this was really struggle, because those who had power, all media, electronic media, especially TV channels are very influential in Ukraine, have been held by those. Which means why, maybe I will change question, why in these conditions it was for the first time, because this is the point, for the first time during last 5 years, system is changing. System is changing towards functioning market economy from oligarchic, corrupted, non-functioning system. Still only partially, it was not done enough, but good question also is, okay, why it is possible if they had such kind of unlimited power? Firstly, because, and this is very important, after Russian aggression, price was huge, 17% in 2 years recession, losing a part of territory, but on the other side, it was solved the biggest problem of, or precondition for Ukrainian reforms. It was cancelled this geopolitical ambiguity, which before existed, and before, if it was not there, maybe we'll go there, you know, country was divided, which means it was created one political nation, Ukrainian political nation, and majority will to go to EU and to do reforms, first. Second, strong and growing influence of the NGOs, also media, I have to say, are playing important role in this regard, because, yeah, majority of them are still under ownership of oligarchs, but oligarchs don't like each other, they're fighting each other, and finally you have plurality and openness, yeah? Then IFIs, and not only IFIs, but also Western partners and European Union, it played also very, very important role. And then new young people also in the government, also in the parliament, which was decisively important. Subjective reasons, which means objective reason is that it was impossible to fulfill these expectations, you know, because by public opinion polls, immediately after Euromaidan, when people have been asked, what do you expect as a result of this revolution? The main answer was majority expected to put oligarchs to the jail and to increase salaries and living of standard. Despite of this, what came? Recession, devaluation, reduction of the living of standard, but of course not as a result of reforms, as a result of lack of reforms 20 plus years before and Russian aggression. But because it was not communicated enough, then of course this kind of general dissatisfaction grew up. And now we are in a very strange situation. For instance, what Prime Minister is correctly arguing, also on TV, during last 3 years, in dollar terms, minimum wage was increased 3 times, average wage was in dollar terms increased 2 times in 3 years. Pensions have been increased maybe 2.5 times. Despite of this, it is huge dissatisfaction. Also because expectations have been even higher, but I think mainly, even more important is that people feel unjust. Because not only this recession, but also nobody was punished for everything this, and we cannot say that corruption doesn't exist. Still corruption exists, especially because we don't have sufficient enough progress in this punishment, in this law enforcement, in this part of the fighting against corruption. But what we have, and very good illustration for these expectations and not fulfilled expectations, is if people now are asked in Ukraine, did you give more bribes as in the past, or have you been asked more for the bribes as in the past? The average answer is no, it decreased significantly. But if another question is, do you think corruption was decreased or increased? They are answering increased. Which means because they are not comparing today's situation with the past, they are comparing today's situation with their expectations. And this is of course politics, which means it is connected with this. Now, another problem which was mentioned also by Marek is the political system. Division of the executive power between president and government, if of course very, very risky, it creates a lot of tensions, a lot of transaction costs. It is obstacle for doing reforms more effectively and quicker. On other side, it is necessary to say that it serves as kind of insurance against authoritarian regime, because if power is concentrated in one place, then it is easier to take power and to have a regime like in Belarus or Russia. But still, it is the problem. It is one of the reasons why it is not going on such quickly. Then another problem, which was again mentioned by Marek, but let me explain why I am also optimist, but also careful optimist and maybe mid-term a little bit pessimist. In Ukraine, it doesn't work like in other countries, like Central European, Western countries, that we have coalition majority in the government. This coalition majority is supporting coalition government. Coalition government is preparing legislation, reform legislation, and then this coalition majority in parliament is supporting this legislation. And opposition is against, in fighting with the government and with the opposition. No. But it was never like that in Ukraine. When we did analysis of the relationship between government and parliament during last 27 years, from the beginning of the creation of the Ukraine, the highest support for the government legislation was during Azarov's government, during Yanukovych. It was 55% only. Only 55% of the government legislative proposal have been passed at that time. During last 5 years, it was somewhere between 35 and 40%. Can you imagine when Slovakia, when I was in the Slovakian governments, when we did reforms, for instance, 2003, we have been the most reform government in the world by the World Bank, and I looked at this. Government prepared 298 law proposals, 297 have been passed in the parliament. One was not passed. Then, in Ukraine, it works like that. You have coalition, formally you have coalition, and formally you have opposition. But every legislation proposal is struggle and trying to find a majority, despite if it is coalition or opposition. And majority of legislation which was passed finally was not prepared by the government, but by the MPs. And now question, okay, if it is the same in this regard, how it is possible that now this is different? Different because now system is changing. Now reforms are going on. They're going on, maybe not such quick, but they are going on. What is the main reason of this qualitative change? That before, this system was used for vested interest and narrow groups' interests, and now it is somehow going on. Decisive are new young MPs. We call there is well-known group of Euro-optimists. There are about 50, 60 MPs, almost young and new for the first time MPs in the parliament, and they are decisive force. Usually they are voted, and they are in all political parties, coalition, opposition. Usually they are voted in favor of reform legislation and against detrimental anti-reform legislation. And now, why I'm optimist, but also careful optimist. I'm optimist because I expect that now, despite of unclear what will be real policy, because if you have new president and new political party which is going to win elections, which didn't have program, didn't have team, then of course it is very difficult to expect what will be his policy. But at least this party, new Vakarchuk's party, other parties, even Poroshenko's party, they declared that they will propose new people to the parliament. Which means I'm also optimist because we can expect that it will be even bigger proportion of the new, young, let's say pro-reform people, which will hopefully speeding up the reform process. Second reason why I'm optimist is, but mainly from the short-term perspective, is the real situation. It was explained by Marek, by Hlip, that now, this year and next 2 years, Ukraine has very high payments of debt, of foreign debt. Which means now any government who will come, any, despite who will lead this government and what will be the composition, will have only two possibilities. Either to continue in cooperation with IMF, EU, and others, or to go to default. Of course, default means devaluation, reduction of living of standard, and so on, and losing confidence and trust among creditors, which means I expect that any kind of government will have to, at least because they will want to avoid this scenario. What I'm more afraid, and then we have this higher proportion of the new MPs, which is another argument for continue in reforms. What I'm afraid is that from midterm perspective, after overcoming this most difficult period of dependency on the official financing and of the program, and we can expect that it will be overcome in a few years, then I'm afraid mainly because I don't see and I don't feel strong enough ownership of reforms. Let me give you just one, and I will finish by that. One example, tariffs. Gas tariffs are in Ukraine, it is the most sensitive topic. I haven't seen any politician in Ukraine who is saying we have to do this because it is source of corruption, it was source of dependency on Russia, it was source of underdeveloped our energy sector, it was source of very low energy efficiency, which means if government and all politicians are arguing, yes, we have to do this because IMF is pushing us to do, and others are fighting against, are proposing immediately after taking power to reduce tariffs again for the 50%, then it could be dangerous. Because if this leverage will disappear in a few years and it will be not replaced by strong ownership of reforms, understanding of the situation, but it is impossible to have without communication, without fighting, without explaining. And this is what I miss, which means this, and hopefully it will. We still have time, which is in my opinion, the most important is to use this time, this next 3-4 years, during which it will be necessary to help, to change this situation, to communicate, to explain, and to strengthen this ownership of reforms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miklos, for picturing out this really particularities of Ukraine system, explaining how it is really works and what you should consider in order to evaluate Ukraine's development. And of course, thank you especially for this ownership message. And now, turning to our audience, we have now, quite some time for the questions and answers. We have seen the picture from different angles. People are leaving not very interested in asking questions, but those who are staying and have particular questions, yes, I see first hand. Please feel free. Yeah, shall we? Yeah.
My name is Delia Manu. Oh, I don't need it. Thank you very much. So I'm representing an American company, Direct Computer Resources, as well as a huge organization in the States, Internet Security Alliance. And we're deeply involved in data security and data protection and cyber security. It's okay like that? Oh my God. Yeah? Okay. So I start again. Okay. My name is Delia Manu. I represent an American company here on a European territory, Direct Computer Resources, and Internet Security Alliance organization located in the States. We are deeply involved in cybersecurity and the protection of the data. I'm coming here with a lot of interest because I hope that everybody here, and even out of this saal, is very interested in what's going on in Ukraine. And I think that we know the concern of the people. I just try to read all and get all the documentation possible via media and so about Ukraine. We know that it's a deep conflict in between Russia and Ukraine. We know that a lot of countries will discuss, and it's very clear here, I think, what's going on internally point of view in Ukraine. But I think also so that each country, and mostly the countries, from Eastern Europe, like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, where also corruption exists for, oh my God, and everywhere, how do you protect and how do you think, because economics and moving forward, as you described here, and all the issues that you face, you cannot do that without a protection. And I'll just split my question in two. First of all, it was told to us that, the gas eventually would be cut by the Russians from here in 2020. How Ukraine just planned. It's very important, I think, beyond all kind of oligarchy interest, it's the interest of the country that needs to survive. If we want peace, we just prepare for the war, okay? So how do you support, or how do you see that eventually the government, the country, the other entities, private sector, public sector, will eventually replace or just get independent from this, what we name, dependence of Russia? This is one thing, because past year I assisted to a very interesting event organized by Hungarian and Romanian authorities, and they just bring bridges and channels, and so they both go via Romania and Hungary in order to get independent from Russia. Second question, knowing what happened in Estonia and we were just deep involved with providing with cybersecurity advice. So if something like that occurs in Ukraine, how you prepare people and a crisis, entity and so on in such a way that you can face an eventual this kind of cyber attack coming from the Russians. It's not the first time, and unfortunately not the last time that they will do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, regarding the gas to Russia, Ukraine last maybe even 2 years is not importing no cubic meter from Russia. Everything is imported through Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. What Hrib mentioned, I think also Marek, is transition of the gas from Russia to Europe. And this is a long-term contract is expiring at the end of this year, and this is the problem that no progress in restructuring of Naftogaz is creating problems with the possibility to agree new agreement, which means this is not about dependency of the Ukraine on Russian gas. It is dependency on incomes from this, which are significant. It is about 1% of GDP of no. $3 billion, which is, even more than about 3% of GDP. But what is important? Ukraine, before Euromaidan, Ukraine imported 50% of its gas, of consumption of the gas from Russia. At the same time, Ukraine is the third richest country in Europe for gas and oil, after Russia and Norway. But because this mismanagement, lack of reforms, and especially tariffs, who will invest in the impossibility to invest, not opening market, it was impossible to use. Now, current government has planned to be self-sufficient in gas extraction until 2020. As I know, it is going slower than it was expected. Maybe it will be not 2020, maybe it will be 2021, 22. But Ukraine can be, but of course it is dependent on investment, also foreign investment to this new extraction of the gas. And cyber security, of course, Ukraine is, I mean, dealing this problem last 5 years very intensively.
This energy issue, we are very dependent on the European Union, and we are very dependent like in 2 dimensions. Like the first dimension is doing as much as possible to prevent Nord Stream 2 to be put into operations in the near future. Like we currently understand that it will not be possible to start its operations from January 1st, 2020 as it was expected, and it's good for Ukraine because like the longer will be the delay, the higher are the chances for Ukraine to get the gas transit contract with Russia on a reasonable terms. So which is one part, and the second part is really helping Ukrainian authorities to devise a strategy. In fact, like as Ivan mentioned, like it is a very big problem that having such a strong enemy as Russia and Gazprom, we were not able to come with a clear path forward, like how should we increase our own gas production, what should we do with the gas transit system in terms of like for example inviting EU companies to be co-owners of this transit system, or for example like having the sort of private-public partnership. Like in fact it was like energy policy unfortunately was the weakest link in Groisman's government, that is in the office for the last 3 years, and to large extent it resulted in what we see now. So we still need EU assistance in helping to overcome this turbulent period that will certainly occur this winter.
Thank you. And then Irina. You as well?
Irina, if I may first, yeah. My name is Irina Sklar, actually representing Naftogaz here from Naftogaz Brussels office. This issue was raised and Naftogaz. and Naftogaz was mentioned several times. I don't have a question. I would like to make a remark. First, to Mark's statement, because Mark said that Naftogaz restructuring was supposed to start several years ago. It did not start. It did start. It's not yet there. It's not yet finished. And why it's not yet finished, we said it on different occasions. We can reiterate it again. Naftogaz has proposed on different occasions to Gazprom to reassign the current gas transit contracts, which expires, as was mentioned, at the end of the year, on an independent or not on a system operator. First blatantly refused. So even if we were ready right now, we wouldn't be able to do it till the end of this year. So we are responsible for the contract at least till the end of the year. So till the end of the year, Western system stays with Naftogaz. It doesn't mean that Naftogaz is doing nothing. So Naftogaz and with Ukrtransgaz, with our subsidiary currently, we have a timeline of unbundling restructuring process. We see on our part that we are largely in line with this timeline. It can be consulted. It's published on the Ukrtransgaz official website, so everyone who is interested can consult this. On the question, so yes, just the statement. So we could argue whether Naftogaz or Ukraine was efficient or not with unbundling as of 1st January, maybe 2nd, 3rd January, but not before. So before it's maybe no ground for discussion, I would say. And on the relations with Russia, it was said that Naftogaz is not buying gas. I would just correct, we were not buying gas for more than 3 years, not for more than 2 years. So yes, we are quite efficient in getting independence from this point of view. For gas production in Ukraine, it was also rightly mentioned, we need to increase it. Objective reasons on Naftogaz side that we had a lot of dividends, rate of dividends repayment to the government, and there was another objective reason. There were no auction for new fields. As I understand, this auction has started, so maybe the trend will change, but it was not possible for us at the group to change it before for some objective reasons, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Irina, for this precision. And now to Dmitro. We can pass the microphone here, and then we will turn to
Hi,
this,
my name is Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine, and as I'm working for a wide public, I can afford to ask maybe naive questions. So my first question is to you, Florin. If speaking in simple words, could you please describe what does it mean for Ukraine to announce default? You know, so that what does it mean for its face in Europe and for European, in particular EU assistance to Ukraine? The second question is partially answered by Irina, but still, Marek, it was for you, because recently we had a chief of Naftogaz coming to Brussels, and they have held a huge conference here and stated that they already adopted all the gas legislation to the European standards. So that I just curious, I agree with that or not, because at that conference we were speaking about the formation of some kind of energy market, including Ukrainian facilities. This is a question. And for Ivan, if I may, we already mentioned that one of the locomotive for Ukrainian economy is the agriculture. But we can hardly call Ukraine like an agriculture country, because it's had quite developed industries. So that we know that taking any kind of reforms in any country, there are some very separate and exact and just locomotives pushing the economy ahead. Except the agriculture, what kind of resources you see in Ukraine? Thanks.
Thanks. And here I saw several. Yes, one and Yana. Yeah. Then the next round. Yeah. No, they're here. Right here. Yana, and then you. Okay, you can start from there.
Sorry. Thanks. Yana Kovzova, Rasmussen Global. My question is slightly related to what was asked before about default. The numbers you've given for debt repayment for the next 3 years are quite scary. how confident is the panel that Ukraine can pay its external debts for the 3 years ahead, given that it's, by my count, is what, 20% of GDP roughly, of what Ukraine needs to pay? Maybe I missed the numbers. I just wanted to ask.
About 20.
And the second question is, you talked a lot about how the macroeconomical situation looks good. And then the challenges and reforms that can lead to improvement include another wave of reforms, which in the short term will have another negative impact on citizens' purses, right? If we talk about further reform of the banking sector, gas tariffs, or pension system. So how do you see that connected to improving the micro level, the livelihood of people? Because if you ask average Ukrainians these days, how is your economic situation? I think they're not going to give you a very optimistic outlook. So which of the reforms that you've outlined can help improve the situation for people in addition to improving the macroeconomic situation? Or is this the fact that, for the next 3 years, Ukraine needs to work on macro and, the trickle-down effect will be delivered after the next 3 years and not now? Thanks.
And the last question on this round. Yeah? Here.
Angela, I will ask question for News Lithuania Euractiv. It's
Can you present yourself?
Angela Kedaitin. I will ask question for News Lithuania from Euractiv. It's one of my affiliations as journalist, volunteering but journalist. So you said in one presentation that how much million Ukrainians left labor market of Ukraine for other countries. So I want to know what is situation in labor market of Ukraine, because I can confirm that in Lithuania we have a lot of Ukrainian workers and we're happy about their very good workers. But we even changing our supermarkets, let's say nomenclature for Ukrainians who are coming to our labor market, and now they are started to leave to Germany, here to France, I don't know, to other countries. So for me it's interesting what you are doing, let's say, to keep these indeed good skilled people in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. So we will have now the questions. Yeah, who would like to start? Yeah.
I could start, yeah. So, there was a question on default, and it is linked also to Jana's question on macroeconomic stability. I believe that it will have very, very, very big impact on ordinary people's life in Ukraine, as there will be another blow to real incomes. We will certainly have huge depreciation of hryvnia. It will be another blow to the banking system, and also even more important, it will be a very big blow to Ukrainian reputation, to the reputation of Ukraine for a long term period, because there is still a risk perceived by many abroad that, you elected comedian as a president, and then people find out that this comedian is influenced by just one very creative oligarch, and this one very creative oligarch just decided for some reasons that he need to get his money back from the Ponzi schemes that he built under the name of Privatbank, and that is enough reason for the government of the large country to announce a sovereign default. And on another side, on Jana's question, it is absolutely possible to avoid macroeconomic instability. There is a plan that was put in place in your speech on the help and on macroeconomic assistance from the European Union, IMF financing, World Bank financing, tapping private markets, and generally it is not even requiring any insurmountable amount of work to attract financing that we need for this 2.5 years. It will just maintain an IMF program or negotiation a new one. We do not need to do anything that will be hugely unpopular, because like the currently gas prices that were mentioned by Ivan are already on market level. We do not need to increase those prices. So we do not, like when we speak about IMF program conditionality in Ukraine, they are unpopular, but unpopular among corrupt elites and vested interests. Like we do not have to do anything now that will be unpopular among regular people, because it will influence their pockets. Like there could be some irrational things like land moratorium or like privatization of state property that should be communicated to general public, but there is nothing that will have an impact, like for example austerity program for Greece. So it is not the issue of like introducing re-establishing macroeconomic stability by something drastic. No, it is not the case. So it is absolutely just a matter of work that should be done. And like I know, like on the impact of people, like certainly like you need to it is to more extent the question of what should prevent. And it is really the issue of basics, because like for example in 2008 when we had repercussions of global financial crisis in Ukraine, I was working in private business, and I just recall that for 1 month we just had no business at all. Like we like all our clients and partners were just doing nothing. They were just trying to understand what is going on and like what will be the exchange rate, what will be the inflation, what will be the market for their goods and services. And just you need not to underestimate the impact of like just pure macroeconomic stability, and then you should build on this by conducting structural reforms that we all mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay, two issues. I agree with Hribis that default can be avoided, assuming that macroeconomic policy of new government will be responsible. Of course, repayment of the debt will require new borrowing. So here will be two issues will be crucial: further continuation cooperation with IMF and other donors, and also convincing this part which can be refinanced by markets, convincing markets that policy is responsible and in some medium to long term can lead to further decline of debt to GDP ratio. Your another point, Jana, on cost reforms reminds me the debate from 1990s which we had in many countries, and I would say entire region, about what strategy of reforms is preferable, whether so-called shock therapy, which in my opinion it always was portrayed in some biased way because nobody likes shock. I always call fast reforms versus so-called gradual or gradual or slow reforms. My argument, and not only theoretical argument, because I think that the advantage which both Ivan to larger extent and me to smaller extent we had, that we also practically dealt with this issue, not only as analysts and policy advisors, but also as policymakers, is that, of course, upfront dealing with some challenges, especially with macroeconomic fiscal ones, they, of course, requires taking many unpopular decisions. But if we do this in fast and complex and consequent way, then you can expect having results of decision relatively quickly. If you hesitate, if you are going slow, then the problem is that you extend period of pain, and then also you don't see results. And in my some kind of comparative perspective, because in my analytical and policy advising experience, Ukraine is the not only country which I dealt with, is the unfortunately, it's the case of slow reform traps that if some things were done in more decisive way in 2014, 15, 16, today probably the situation could be better and with less political uncertainty. Well, of course, I'm not going to speculate and make any political counterfactual scenario because politics contemporary is very unpredictable. This is another story, but economic situation would be probably better and some fruits of reform in terms of higher growth would be visible. I also agree with that this reform agenda which we both presented, or we presented de facto, doesn't require so dramatic sacrifices. This is actually the main pain was already incurred, and the problem now is avoid a new collapse, a new potential pain, which may be a scenario if not only of intentional default, because this I think is political and economic nonsense, but even if it happens anyway because of the lack of action on time. So here I think the stake is very high, but sooner some things will be decided and done. This is more chance that people will see some fruits of this effort few years from now.
Yeah, maybe some comments because we are quite late. But on the debt and related to that, I think that it's important to point that indeed the macroeconomic policy has moved into the good territory, and now the challenge is to keep the track. So it's not a country that it is in a position to make a huge adjustment on that front. That has been done, well done, and is a matter of keeping it. Debt has been going down since 16, was 80%, now it's, yes, above 60, but still in a downward trajectory. I would say this is what needs to be kept, the downward trajectory. And what is most important is to look at maturities and to look at the borrowing conditions. And it's absolutely essential that the country continues to be able to access both public support, IMF, EU, and private markets at a good price, not at a high price, because then you will not be able to afford it, but the good price comes as a result of macro stability and reforms. So that all that is linked. Now, if in this context now a default would come, what will happen? All this is going to be destroyed from one day to the next. That, I think it's the basic, simple language. And that would be a big price for citizens. Exchange rate depreciation, uncontrolled depreciation, inflation, and non-access to finance anywhere, and obviously no investment because uncertainty in the country, lack of trust, lack of credibility. So I think that's a scenario, even more so in a situation where if that would happen because a sort of political decision, that would be even worse, because it's not that the country is in a situation that it requires a huge adjustment, it would be just a sort of political choice, which would be even a worse sign. That's how I see that. And then on just one comment on the energy and other reforms, I think what is really important is to be able to have a strategy that the authorities and the players in the country can explain that it is going to deliver good things the normal people, not for those you mentioned that are benefiting from the system and the oligarchs and all the rest. But you need a package. So if you discuss energy tariffs, you have to have together with that the reform of the sector that is going to deliver an efficient energy delivery. You have to have energy efficiency, for instance, that will reduce the cost for people. And you have to have part of this package something on targeted social transfers that can cope with those that are at the lowest income level that may have a first period of really having the heat of this change. So that's the package that you have to be able to explain to the citizens.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues that I don't see any problem with avoiding default in case of continuing in the program with IMF and other IFIs. But it will be dependent, at least in next 3 years. Without having this program, it is almost 100% sure that it will be impossible to avoid default. Regarding painful reforms, I very agree. I just to add two things which haven't been said. Firstly, benefits, if Ukraine has potential for much higher growth as today is reality. Ukraine has potential for 6, maybe 7% high sustainable growth because its potential is really big and it is now much, much below its potential. But of course, precondition are reforms, especially investment, especially foreign direct investment, which is the quickest source of investment. There are empirical evidences from all over the world countries that country which want to grow more than 6% longer than 10 years has to have share of investment, all investment to GDP more than 25%. Better somewhere around 30%. Ukraine has today about 17%, which means having 27% means necessity to have additional $10 billion every year of the investment. Not only FDI, overall investment, which means public, private, foreign. But foreign investment are the quickest potential source for increase. And it is connected with your question of what can be engine of this kind of high and sustainable growth. And that's true that today it is agriculture, but I think it has to be also industry, of course. Ukraine, and I will give you a very brief comparison with Slovakia, with my country. 27 years ago, okay, the Ukrainian industrial potential was better than Slovakian. Ukraine produced rockets and planes and Slovakia tanks, yeah? Overall export in 95, Slovakia had overall export 50% of overall Ukrainian export. In 2005, the same. In 2015, Slovakia's export is 2 times bigger than Ukrainian. We have 5 million, Ukrainians are 40 million. Majority in Slovakian export are industrial products, especially automobiles, but not only, which means sophisticated industrial products. In Ukrainian export, only less than 9% are industrial products. Reason? Absence of reforms, restructuring, modernization, investment. How to do this? To do reforms, especially what is the most important is law enforcement, property right protection, privatization, land market reform, demonopolization, deregulation, energy opening. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And let me thank the speakers for giving this really rich knowledge of Ukraine's economy and all factors connected to this. And I believe that those who already have left, although we're just a few minutes running out of the planned conference, I believe that this is because they have had already so much information that they needed more time to digest it. Yes? So I would agree with you. I hope you would agree with me. So let me thank again our speakers. We thank you. And we thank Bruegel for hosting, for partnership, and to keep your appetite, to feed your appetite with Ukraine's developments. We just want to announce our new activity on the 12th of June on the railway reform, which has been already mentioned today. And those of you who are interested, please contact me here or my colleagues Sergei or Irina. So thank you very much, and let's keep in touch. See you. Bye.